Sunday morning in Cyprus, August of 2005. A holiday flight takes off. A Boeing 737, bound for Prague with a layover in Athens. 115 passengers and 6 crew. Most of the passengers were Cypriot, most of them on holiday. The flight took off at 7 minutes past 9 in the morning, local time. It climbed into a clear summer sky over the Mediterranean, and for the next 2 hours and 56 minutes, it flew itself. Nobody on board was capable of flying it. Nobody on board was capable of doing anything at all. When 2 F-16 fighters from the Hellenic Air Force finally caught up with the aircraft over the Aegean Sea, what they saw was this. The captain's seat was empty. The first officer was slumped forward over his controls. Behind them, in the cabin, 3 passengers sat motionless with oxygen masks on their faces. Other masks dangled from the overhead units, casting shadows in the daylight coming through the opposite windows. Nothing was moving. The aircraft they were watching was Helios Airways Flight 522. In about 40 minutes, it would run out of fuel, descend through cloud, and crash into the rolling hills of Grammatiko north of Athens. Everyone on board would die. This is the story of how that happened, and it's also the story of a young man who almost saved them. Helios Airways was a small airline, the first private carrier ever licensed in the Republic of Cyprus, founded in 1999. By the summer of 2005, it operated a handful of leased Boeing 737s and a single Airbus, mostly running budget charter routes between Cyprus and the cities of Europe. A few years before the accident, Helios had been bought out by an investment company. A new managing director had come in to make the airline profitable, and according to former staff, his approach was simple. He cut costs, then he cut them again. The senior pilots had their wages reduced by 20%, and most of them left. To replace them, Helios began hiring contract pilots through agencies, pilots who would work for less money than a full carrier rate. The strategy was working in the narrow sense that the airline was still flying, but it was not working in any other sense that would really matter. The aircraft at the center of this story was the Boeing 737-300, registration 5B-DBY. Helios had named it Olympia. It was 8 years old. It had flown for a German operator before Helios leased it in 2004. There are 2 things in Olympia's recent history that are worth mentioning before we go any further. The first is that 8 months before the accident, Olympia had a sudden decompression at 35,000 feet on a flight from Warsaw. The crew brought it down safely. The cabin crew reported a hand-sized hole in the rubber seal of the right rear service door. Investigators couldn't determine the cause with confidence. The seal was repaired, the aircraft went back into service. The second is that 10 weeks before the accident, the aircraft's environmental control system, the system that, among other things, manages cabin air, had been written up as faulty 7 separate times. Cooling fan warnings, air leakage, recurring problems that were fixed in isolation but never resolved at the root. Passengers had been complaining about the air conditioning for months. The first officer's mother would later say her son complained repeatedly about the aircraft being cold. No one connected the pattern. The captain of Flight 522 was 59-year-old German named Hans-Jürgen Merten. He had been flying for 35 years. He'd started his career in East Germany flying for the state airline Interflug from 1970 onwards, mostly on Soviet-built jets. At some point during his time there, he was demoted from captain back to first officer. The official reason given was unsettled family issues. Pilots who knew him would later suggest the real reason was political, that in East German aviation, family issues was sometimes a stand-in for things you couldn't say openly. When Interflug collapsed with the reunification of Germany in 1991, Merton applied to fly for Lufthansa. He was rejected. The reason given was that he was assessed as lacking team skills, being a poor communicator, and having a difficult temper. What followed was the kind of career a pilot has when no major airline will keep him for long. Saarland Airlines, Air Berlin, Virgin Express, Falcon Air, Sabena, EasyJet. A cargo carrier in Iceland, a holiday operator in the Czech Republic, a small UK airline called Channel Express, which recently rebranded itself as Jet2. Channel Express hired him in mid-April of 2005. Within a month, they let him go. The reason, according to court testimony years later, was that Merton had repeatedly failed to comply with standard operating procedures. A former pilot named Sharon McVicker, who had flown with him as an observer in May of 2005, testified during a single approach into Manchester, Merton had ignored his co-pilot's instructions to slow down on 3 separate occasions. He'd ignored air traffic control's airspeed instructions. On the landing itself, he'd failed to reduce engine throttle sufficiently, and the brakes had malfunctioned. McVicker described him as overconfident, unwilling to share information with his co-pilot, and apparently unaware of what was happening in the cockpit around him. Channel Express terminated his contract. 3 weeks later, Helios Airways hired him through a Dublin-based recruitment agency on a short-term contract for the summer holiday season. Helios never contacted Channel Express for a reference. The first officer was Pampos Charalambous, 51 years old, Cypriot. He had started in aviation as a ground engineer for Cyprus Airways before retraining as a pilot in his 30s. By 2005, he had flown for Helios for 5 years, about 8,000 hours total, 4,000 of them in the 737. His most recent operator proficiency check, in March of 2005, had carried a notable comment from the examiner. Standards achieved, but with room for lots of improvement. Some difficulties met in complex tasks. Do not rush through checklists. Colleagues described him as increasingly unhappy at Helios. He had been actively looking for another job. He had complained more than once about Captain Merton's attitude. 2 weeks before the accident, the two of them had argued. According to people who knew them both, Charalambous had told Merton directly that he was letting personal problems interfere with his work. They were rostered to fly together on the morning of August 14th. The cabin crew were 4 people. The chief flight attendant was a 32-year-old Greek woman named Louisa Voturi. She had been called in last minute that morning to replace a colleague who had reported sick. The junior steward was Andreas Prodromou, 25 years old, Cypriot, cabin crew at Helios for 2 years. I want you to remember Andreas, because he matters more in this story than anyone else. He held a commercial pilot's license, which he had earned at his own expense. He had ambitions of being promoted from cabin crew to first officer at Helios the moment a slot opened up. He was not trained on the Boeing 737. His pilot's license qualified him to fly small piston craft, not commercial jets. He had not originally been scheduled for Flight 522. He had agreed to take the assignment at the last minute for one reason. His girlfriend was on the flight. She was 22 years old. She was also Helios cabin crew, also called in last minute that morning to replace someone else who had reported sick. So that was the crew. A captain who had been quietly pushed out of every airline he'd worked for in the last 10 years. A first officer who had been told he rushed through checklists and was unhappy with his captain. And a junior steward who only got on the flight because his girlfriend was working on it. Now I want to tell you about the engineer. The engineer was a 44-year-old Brit named Alan Irwin. He was the chief engineer at Helios. He had been with the airline for years, and by all accounts, he was good at his job. On the night before the accident, Olympia flew from London Heathrow to Larnaca. It landed at Larnaca at 1:25 in the morning, local time. During that flight, the cabin crew had reported something familiar, banging noises near the right rear service door. The seal around the door appeared to be freezing. The captain wrote it up in the technical log and requested a full inspection. When the aircraft arrived in Larnaca, Alan Irwin and 2 other engineers were waiting for it. They went over the door. They could not find anything visibly wrong with it. To be thorough, Irwin decided to perform a pressurization leak check. This means sealing the aircraft, pressurizing it on the ground using ground equipment, and waiting for any kind of drop in pressure that would indicate a leak. To run this kind of test without firing the aircraft's engines, an engineer has to drive the pressurization system manually, which means before the test, he has to switch the cabin pressurization mode selector, a small rotary switch on the overhead panel of the cockpit, from its normal position, auto, to manual. This is a routine procedure. It happens all the time. The only thing that matters about it for our purposes is that when you're done with the test, you switch it back. Irwin and his team ran the test. The aircraft held pressure. The safety valve operated correctly. They could find no leaks, no abnormal noises. Irwin signed off the maintenance log. Door and local area inspected. Nil defects. Pressure run carried out to max diff. Safety valve operates at 8.25 psi. No leaks or abnormal noises. He released the aircraft for service at 3:15 in the morning. What happens next, technically, is in dispute. The official accident report, written by Greek investigators a year later, concluded that Irwin signed the aircraft off without returning the pressurization switch from manual back to auto, that the switch was left in the wrong position. Irwin himself has always denied this. He has said consistently in court, in depositions, in interviews, that he returned the switch to auto before leaving the cockpit, as he had done over a 20-year career, as he had been trained to do. What is not in dispute is that when the morning crew arrived to fly Olympia to Athens, the switch was in manual. It would stay there. It would stay there through the first officer's pre-flight check. It would stay there through the captain's after-start check. It would stay there through both pilots' joint after-takeoff check. 3 separate checks. 3 separate procedures specifically designed to catch this exact configuration, and nobody caught it. At 7 minutes past 9 in the morning on Sunday the 14th of August 2005, Olympia rotated off the runway at Larnaca International Airport, banked gently to the north, and began climbing into a clear summer sky. There were 115 passengers on board. Most of them were on holiday. 22 of them were children. For the first 4 minutes, everything was normal. Olympia climbed steadily through 10,000 feet, then 15,000. At 11 minutes past 9, the captain contacted Nicosia Area Control and requested clearance for the cruising altitude on the flight plan. Nicosia cleared him to 34,000 feet. The captain acknowledged that was the last clear professional radio transmission anyone would ever receive from the cockpit of Helios 522. What no one in the cockpit had noticed, what no one could see because there's no warning light for it on the 737-300, was that with the pressurization switch in manual and nobody actively operating it, the aircraft's cabin was not pressurizing. I want to explain what that means because it's the heart of what happened. When a passenger aircraft climbs to cruising altitude, the air outside gets very thin. At 34,000 feet, the air outside the cabin is so thin that an unprotected adult human being would lose consciousness within 20 to 30 seconds and die not long after. The way airliners deal with this is by sealing the cabin and pumping it full of compressed air drawn from the engines. The cabin is effectively kept at the air pressure of about an 8,000-foot mountain, regardless of how high the aircraft is actually flying. The pressurization system on the 737-300 has 3 settings: auto, which manages the cabin pressure automatically as the aircraft climbs and descends; standby as a backup; and manual, which is used by maintenance engineers on the ground. In manual, the system doesn't pressurize the cabin unless somebody is actively driving it, and nobody was actively driving it. So as Olympia climbed, the cabin altitude was climbing with it, and the air inside was getting thinner every minute, every second. At 12,040 feet of cabin altitude, about 10 minutes into the flight, an alarm sounded in the cockpit. It was a high, urgent horn. The cabin altitude warning. It activates whenever the cabin altitude exceeds 10,000 feet, which means, in plain English, the people in this aircraft are about to start running out of oxygen. Both pilots heard it. Neither put on his oxygen mask. I need to explain why, because this is one of the strangest design failures in commercial aviation history. The cabin altitude warning horn on the Boeing 737-300 makes exactly the same sound as a different alarm, the takeoff configuration warning. The takeoff configuration warning is this alarm that sounds when you try to take off with the flaps in the wrong position, or the parking brake set, or some other critical setting wrong. It only happens on the ground. So a horn that sounds exactly like the takeoff configuration warning going off at 16,000 feet in a 737 that has just climbed normally through the first 10 minutes of a routine flight is at minimum deeply confusing. There was a procedure for diagnosing it. The pilots did not follow it. What they did instead was call the company. At 14 minutes past 9, with the aircraft passing through approximately 16,000 feet, Captain Merton radioed the Helios Operations Center in Larnaca. The dispatcher who took the call was confused by what he was hearing. The captain was reporting the takeoff configuration warning on, an alarm that, as the dispatcher knew, cannot sound at 16,000 feet, and then immediately reporting cooling equipment normal and alternate offline. 2 unrelated complaints, neither of which made sense. The dispatcher passed the call on to the on-duty ground engineer, which happened to be Alan Irwin, the same engineer who had inspected the aircraft 8 hours earlier. Irwin came on the line. The captain reported in increasingly garbled language that the equipment cooling fan lights were off. Irwin asked him to repeat it because the message didn't make sense. Those lights are normally off when the cooling system is working properly. The captain repeated his statement, but contradicted it. That they are not switched off, he said. Irwin paused. He thought for a moment. The pressurization panel and the equipment cooling panel sit very close to each other on the cockpit overhead. There were 4 warning lights on the pressurization panel, any one of which would tell a pilot something was wrong with the cabin pressure. He asked the captain a single direct question: Can you confirm that the pressurization panel is selected to auto? There was no answer. After a beat, the captain came back on the line. He did not answer the question. Instead, he asked his own, "Where are my equipment cooling circuit breakers?" Erwin answered, "Behind the captain's seat." What we know about what happens next, we know from the flight data recorder, the cockpit voice recorder, and interference. Captain Merton had unstrapped from his seat. He turned around to look for the equipment cooling circuit breakers, where Erwin had told him they were. The captain's microphone keyed for a few more seconds, then went silent at 20 minutes and 21 seconds past 9. That was the last sound from the cockpit for 45 minutes. By the time Merton was out of his seat and looking behind it, the cabin altitude was at approximately 18,000 feet. At that altitude, the time of useful consciousness for an active, unprotected adult, which is what Merton now was, is somewhere between 20 and 30 seconds. I want to spend a moment on hypoxia, because it's central to understanding why none of the people on board this aircraft were able to save themselves. Hypoxia is the body's response to oxygen starvation. The first symptoms are cognitive, not physical: confusion, poor judgment, inability to follow simple instructions, inability to finish a sentence you started. People experiencing hypoxia often feel euphoric and often become absolutely certain that they are fine. The most cruel part of it is that hypoxia removes the ability to recognize that anything is wrong with you. By the time the physical symptoms set in, the cognitive ones have usually already disabled the person's ability to do anything about it. Captain Merton looked behind his seat for the circuit breakers he no longer remembered the purpose of, lost consciousness somewhere on the floor of the cockpit. First Officer Haralambous, sitting in his seat with the cabin altitude warning still sounding in his ears, lost consciousness at his controls. Around the same time, a master caution light came on in the cockpit. It was telling the pilots in plain language that the passenger oxygen masks had deployed in the cabin. The masks had dropped from the overhead units throughout the cabin. 115 passengers had pulled them down, fitted them to their faces, and breathed. The masks contained approximately 12 minutes of oxygen each. At 23 minutes and 32 seconds past 9, the autopilot leveled Olympia at 34,000 feet. Both pilots were unconscious. The cabin altitude warning had continued to sound unanswered in the cockpit. The aircraft, now flying itself, turned toward Athens. I have to be honest with you about what I'm about to tell you. We don't know what happened in the passenger cabin during the next 45 minutes. The cockpit voice recorder on this aircraft only captured the last 30 minutes before the crash. Most of what happened in the cabin, most of what happened to those 115 people is silence. We can infer some of it, not all of it. We know the cabin crew had access to 4 portable emergency oxygen cylinders, each capable of providing about an hour of oxygen for one person. We know that 3 of the 4 cylinders were eventually used. We know the cockpit door, after the 9/11 attacks, was reinforced and locked, openable from the inside or by a numerical code from the cabin side that not all crew members were given. Andreas had the code. We know that the passenger oxygen masks were the chemical generator type, which means once activated, they delivered oxygen for about 12 minutes, and then they delivered nothing. What we don't know is what the cabin crew thought or did in the time between the masks running out and their own consciousness fading. The official report describes their actions as puzzling. It's, in some ways, the central unanswered question of the incident. There is a theory, and I want to say up front that this is a theory. The investigators raised it. The evidence is consistent with it, but it's not proven, and it cannot be proven. There were 22 children on board Helios 522. Their oxygen masks ran out at the same time as everyone else's, about 12 minutes after deployment. After that, they had nothing. The cabin crew, who had access to portable cylinders, would have remained conscious a bit longer than the passengers. They had a small window in which they were capable of acting, and the passengers would not be. If within that window a cabin crew member removed her own portable oxygen and gave it to a child whose masks had run out, or shared it back and forth at 34,000 feet, she would have approximately 30 seconds of useful consciousness before she lost the ability to act. 3 of the 4 portable cylinders were used. None of the cabin crew reached the cockpit during the time they were used. This is the most generous reading of the evidence that somebody, maybe more than one person, in the cabin of Helios 522 understood in the brief window in which understanding was still possible, that no one was coming to save them, and that they spent the time they had left trying to keep a child breathing. We'll never know. The aircraft that came down at Grammatico was not in a condition for that question to be answered. I want you to hold the possibility of it, though, because I think it matters. While that was happening, on the ground, the ghost plane was beginning to attract attention. At 29 minutes past 9, the Helios dispatcher tried again to reach the cockpit. There was no response. He contacted Nicosia Area Control. For the next 6 minutes, Nicosia called Flight 522 on every frequency they had. The working frequency, the emergency frequency, through a relay aircraft, nothing. At 36 minutes past 9, Olympia crossed the boundary from Cypriot airspace into Greek airspace. Nicosia called Athens and asked them to try. Athens called Flight 522 11 times on the working frequency, 5 times on the emergency frequency. Other aircraft in the area were asked to relay messages. There was no response from Olympia. But the radar still showed the aircraft proceeding correctly along its filed flight plan, exactly as a normal flight would, because the autopilot was flying it. The flight management computer was navigating from waypoint to waypoint, following the route that had been programmed in before takeoff, exactly as designed. At 20 minutes past 10, Olympia passed over Athens at 34,000 feet without descending. The flight management computer, having executed the published missed approach procedure, turned the aircraft toward the KEA navigation beacon to begin holding. It would fly that holding pattern for the next 50 minutes. At 53 minutes past 10, Athens declared an alert phase. The Hellenic Air Force was contacted. 2 F-16 fighters were ordered to scramble. At 23 minutes past 11, during the 6th circuit of the holding pattern, the F-16s made visual contact. What they saw, they reported to the ground. The aircraft was undamaged. There was no fire and no smoke. The captain's seat was empty. The first officer was slumped over the controls. 2 passengers on the left side of the aircraft sat motionless, wearing oxygen masks. Through the window on the right, more masks could be seen dangling from the overhead units, casting shadows in the daylight. A third passenger on the right was also seated, also wearing a mask, also motionless. Nothing in the aircraft was moving. Athens declared a distress phase. Olympia had about 1,200 kilograms of fuel remaining in its tanks. At cruise consumption, that was approximately 16 minutes of flight. We don't know exactly when Andreas regained consciousness. We know he was found in the wreckage to have been the only person on board who was conscious at impact. We know he used a portable oxygen cylinder. We know he eventually made his way to the front of the aircraft. We know he opened the cockpit using the access code. What we don't know is how long any of that took or what he saw on the way. His girlfriend was somewhere in the cabin. The rest of his story we can reconstruct from the cockpit voice recorder, as well as the flight data recorder and the eyewitness account of an F-16 pilot who watched it through the cockpit window from a few hundred feet away. At 48 minutes and 31 seconds past 11, 2 chimes were recorded in the cockpit. 20 seconds later, 2 more chimes, then a longer chime, lasting 20 seconds. These are the cabin-to-cockpit alert systems. Someone in the cabin trying to get the flight crew's attention. A few seconds after the long chime, there was a click similar to the cockpit door opening. Then the rustling sound of an oxygen mask being removed from its stowage box, followed by the hiss of oxygen flowing through the regulator. At approximately 49 minutes past 11, the F-16 pilot saw a man in a light blue shirt and a dark vest enter the cockpit and sit down in the captain's seat. The man was not wearing an oxygen mask. He put on a headset. He placed his hands on the panel in front of him. The F-16 tried to attract his attention. Andreas did not respond. 50 seconds later, at 49 minutes and 50 seconds past 11, the left engine of Olympia flamed out. It had run out of fuel. The aircraft began to descend. The F-16 pilot reported a vapor trail coming from the failing engine. The aircraft banked steeply to the left, leaving the holding pattern, and started heading northwest. The man in the captain's seat, the F-16 pilot reported, occasionally bent forward over the panel, then sat up again. He did not respond to the F-16's attempts to get his attention. I want you to picture this for a second. Andreas Prodromou had a commercial pilot's license for a small piston aircraft. Single-engine planes you fly to a country airfield on a Sunday afternoon. He was now sitting at the controls of a Boeing 737-300 in a fuel-starved descent. One engine already out, the second one running out of its last bit of fuel. Every alarm in the cockpit going off. He had never flown a 737. He had never trained on a 737. He spent his career in commercial aviation up to this point serving drinks in the cabin of this plane. He was, however, alive, and he was trying. At 54 minutes and 18 seconds past 11, the cockpit voice recorder picked up a voice. It was weak. The microphone was barely catching it. The words were, "Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. Helios Airways Flight 522, Athens." A few seconds later, in an even weaker voice, "Mayday, Mayday." The transmissions never reached Athens. The radio in the cockpit was still tuned to Larnaca's frequency from the takeoff hours earlier. Andreas hadn't been able to find the correct frequency for Athens, or hadn't known how to look. His call for help went out to the void. Though the F-16 pilots heard him. When Olympia descended through about 7,000 feet, Andreas, for the first time, appeared to acknowledge the F-16 flying alongside him. He made a hand motion through the cockpit window. The F-16 pilot signaled back. He used the standard interception signal, "Follow me down to the airport." Andreas raised his hand. He pointed downwards through the floor of the aircraft. Then he turned away from the F-16 and looked forward through the windscreen. He didn't look back. At 59 minutes and 47 seconds past 11, the right engine flamed out. Olympia was at 7,000 feet, descending. The cockpit voice recorder, now picking up the ground proximity warning system, recorded its final minutes. Pull up, sink rate, terrain, pull up. At 3 minutes and 32 seconds past noon on the 14th of August 2005, Helios Airways Flight 522 collided with rolling hilly terrain in the vicinity of the village of Ramatico, 33 kilometers from Athens. The aircraft hit the ground at approximately 400 miles per hour on its underside. It disintegrated in a fireball that ignited several acres of dry summer scrubland. All 121 people on board were killed. Subsequent autopsies determined that most of the passengers were still alive at the moment of impact, unconscious but alive. The body of Andreas Prodromou was found in the cockpit. He was the only person on the aircraft who was conscious when it hit the ground. His girlfriend was 22 years old. The Greek Air Accident Investigation Board published their final report 14 months after the crash. 196 pages, 63 findings. The direct cause was stated simply: the pressurization switch was in manual when the aircraft took off. The flight crew did notice during 3 pre-flight checks. When the cabin altitude warning sounded, they did not recognize it. They lost consciousness. The aircraft on autopilot flew until it ran out of fuel. The deeper causes were more numerous. Helios's organizational failures, their cost-cutting, their failure to verify the captain's references, the regulator's failure to enforce its own oversight, the complete breakdown of crew resource management between the captain and first officer before they ever left the gate, and crucially, Boeing's failure to act on previous incidents involving the same warning horn ambiguity that had confused the Helios crew. The same alarm tone for 2 completely different problems. A horn that means you cannot take off on the ground and you cannot survive in the air. The investigation found 10 previous incidents in which 737 flight crews had misinterpreted the cabin altitude warnings as takeoff configuration warnings. In March 2011, 6 years after Helios, the FAA issued a airworthiness directive requiring all 737-100 through 737-500 aircrafts to be retrofitted with 2 additional cockpit warning lights, one to disambiguate the takeoff configuration warning, one to disambiguate the cabin pressurization warning. The fix was simple. It costs very little. It could have been done at any point in the previous 40 years. The legal aftermath was prolonged and unsatisfying. In 2008, 6 former Helios employees were charged with manslaughter. The Cypriot trial, after 2 years, acquitted everybody on the grounds that the prosecution hadn't established a causal link. A separate Greek trial charged 4 men, whose names I will not attempt to pronounce, but this was the chief executive, the operations manager, the chief pilot, and the chief engineer. That one we know. This is Alan Irwin. In April 2012, all 4 were convicted of manslaughter and sentenced to 10 years. In 2013, Alan Irwin's appeal succeeded. He was acquitted. He returned to England, where he now lives in Bedfordshire and works by his own account as an estate agent. The other 3 lost their appeals. Their sentences were upheld, but under Greek law, they were given the option of buying out their sentences for around 79,000 euros each. None of them served prison time. Helios Airways, by then renamed Aegean Airways, ceased operations in November 2006. There is a memorial at Grammatiko, a simple stone marker on the hillside where Olympia came to rest. The names of the dead, a space to leave flowers. Every year on the 14th of August, the families gather there. The family of Andreas Prodromou attends every year. The thing this story leaves us with, the image I cannot get out of my head, the one I think about most when I think about Helios 522, is not the engineer or the airline or the regulator. It's an experienced commercial airline captain in a clear summer sky over the Mediterranean, climbing through 18,000 feet on a routine flight to Athens, suddenly out of his seat, on his hands and knees on the cockpit floor, looking for a circuit breaker. He never found it, and the aircraft kept flying.